Hello and welcome to Circuit Crest TV. I'm your host Brian Jenkins and welcome to Arduino tutorial number 12, an introduction to control structures, also called conditional statements and loops. Now, these let you do some amazing things with a little amount of code. We'll start with the if statement. The if statement checks for a condition and then executes the preceding statement or set of statements if the condition is true. The syntax for an if statement is simple and goes like you see right here. For example, let's say you want to turn on a fan when a certain temperature is reached. To read the temperature, you have a thermistor, which is just a heat-sensitive resistor, connected to the Arduino's ADC, or analog to digital converter, through one of the analog pins. Now, since it has a 10-bit ADC, the values will range from 0 to 1023. So if it's cold, the value will be on the small side, and if it's hot, the value will be larger. You could use an if statement like this one to turn on the fan. This reads the ADC using the analog read function, and then assigns that value to an integer named temp. Here we have the if statement. Let's break it down. We see the word if, and then we see a comparison inside the parentheses. Now that comparison could be anything. It could be less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to or not equal to. And then we have the curly brace there, the opening curly brace. And then you would insert code that would run the fan and then have the closing curly brace. Notice that the code inside the curly braces only gets executed if that conditional statement is true. So if analog read returns a value less than 500, the code does not execute. An if-else statement is like a power-up for your if statements. It allows you greater control over the flow of code than a basic if statement. And this will allow you to test for more than one condition. For example, we can see this code right here. And here we turn on the fan if it gets too hot, just as before. But now, if it gets too cold, we sound an alarm. Note that we can use as many else-if statements as we like. So we can have 3, 4, 5, 10 different conditions. And we would start with if, and then each subsequent condition would have an else-if, else-if, else-if in front of it. Now, the for loop is one of the most useful and common pieces of code out there. And it's often used with arrays, which is a subject that's a bit beyond the scope of basic programming here, but one you'll want to become familiar with. And the syntax can be seen here. Now, at first, the for loop can be confusing and intimidating. But after a while, you'll become good friends. An example from the Arduino website is shown here. And for clarity, I've removed the setup and loop functions, but just know that, of course, the setup and loop functions are required for every sketch. And let's take a closer look at the for loop. We have the word for, and then inside the parentheses, we have 3 different statements. First, we set or initialize the variable I to 0. And this only happens once the first time we go through the for loop. After the first time, this statement is ignored, and the other 2 statements are executed. So after we initialize I, we have a comparison or condition. So here it says I is less than or equal to 255. So as long as I is less than or equal to 255, we run through the loop. And here we already set I to 0. So before we go on, we jump right into the loop. And we execute that code and write the value of I to PWM pin. Then, once that value is written and we have the 10 millisecond delay, we jump back in and we increment I. And we see I++. That increments I by 1. Now, note that you don't have to use the name I. You could call that integer anything you want. You can call it temperature, you can call it mom, you can call it whatever. But oftentimes you'll see for for loops the letter I. But you don't have to use that letter. So we incremented I by 1. We go back to the for loop. We skip the first statement. We've already initialized it, so we don't want to reinitialize it to 0 or we never ever get out of the loop. So I is still less than or equal to 255. We jump back in, do the code, analog, write, and delay, and then increment I to 2, and so forth, until it's 255. Once it's greater than 255, we fall out of the for loop, and the code inside the loop ceases to execute. Now, the while loop is another gem you'll often find yourself using. It will loop continuously and forever until the expression inside the parentheses becomes false. And we can see the syntax here. It's real simple. We just have the word while and then some condition inside the parentheses, and then we have, again, the curly brackets with the code in between. Now, note that the condition is a Boolean expression and it's either true or false. The condition can be many things, like some sort of lesson or equal comparison. We could throw the number 1 in there, which means true, and putting a 1 in there will make the while loop run forever, by the way. And we could even insert a function as our condition. For example, we can do something like this. In this case, the loop will run as long as analog read returns some sort of value that's not 0. And here's another partial example taken from the Arduino website again. Now notice that the plus plus operator has reared its head again and increments the variable var every time we go through the while loop to keep count. So first we initialize an integer var to 0. Then we jump into the loop and we make the comparison 0 is less than 200. So we go in and we do something, and then we increment var by 1. So now var is 1. And again, 1 is still less than 200, so we go back into the loop, and once it reaches 200, we fall out of the loop. That about wraps up our intro to control structures now. There are other control structures in the land of Arduino. However, I wanted to cover the ones you'll see the most. We'll talk about some of the other ones in another tutorial. If you're interested in Arduino and microcontrollers, you'll love how to get started with Arduino in 1 day or less. Get instant access now by clicking the link below in the description.